I started out in building acoustic guitars, actually, in 1972. And that was my initial passion. I was a hippie, folky finger picker. And I then spent the next 5 years focusing on repair and restoration work. I took over the repair department for a large music store near Philadelphia. And I worked there for 5 years, and I really developed my repair and modification chops there. And in '79, I moved back to New York City, which is where I'm from, and I started my own shop there. I was encouraged to do that by a friend of mine who was a New York City session player, a guitar player, and he didn't feel there was anybody doing work as well as mine was in New York, which surprised me, but I trusted him and I took the plunge. And so I immediately, from the get-go, was doing work for all the top session guys in New York. Marcus Miller, Will Lee, John Tropez, David Spinoza, all those quality of players. And that was an incredibly valuable learning experience. So I started making, at that time, you couldn't sell a handmade acoustic guitar for anything. So I started making electric guitars in '79, and I made my first electric bass in 1982. And then I also started working with active electronics for the first time around '79. There was a company in San Francisco called Stars Guitars, which were offshoots of Alembic. And they were the first to market an aftermarket retrofittable preamp for bass, a treble and bass circuit. And so I tried it out. I thought it was pretty impressive. Let another client of mine, he let me put it in his bass. He loved it. And then not long after that, Marcus Miller came in. He was 17. This was '79, so he'd had his jazz bass for 2 years. He had a '77. And he said, do whatever you can to make my bass the best it can be that will cut through more than anybody else playing a jazz bass. And so I retrued the fingerboard and did a refret. I put on a heavier bridge, and I installed the preamp. And we may say that the rest is history, we may say. I mean, it really helped Marcus get the sound that he wanted. And I didn't set out to be a bass maker, but due to my relationship with Marcus and Will and Neil Jason and all the other top New York session guys, the bass thing just took off, and I just rode the horse in the direction it was going. Will is probably the worst person to answer that question for, because Will knows what he wants but has a very hard time articulating it. And it's true, it's hard to talk about sound or the sound you have in your head, you know. So for Will, it was always a lot of try this, try that, and just see what works for him. For example, for years, Will was asking me to be able to give him some more punch. And I tried every different kind of jazz bass pickup for him, quarter pounders, overwound pickups, everything. Nothing worked for him. I tried every wood combination I could. Nothing quite gave him what he was hearing in his head. Ultimately, when we did decide to start R&Ding a Will Lee model together, I told him to take an EQ and play with different frequencies and tell me which frequencies came closest to what he was listening for. And that turned out to be 500 hertz. Now, my preamp is naturally scooped in the 350, 500 range because I have two wide bands. I have a bass band with a frequency center at 40 hertz and a treble band with a frequency center at 4K. And where they don't overlap is in that 350, 400, 500 range. And so the more you boost treble, the more you're attenuating those mids by default. And that's a lot of what's given my bass their Sadowsky sound. That natural scooping there gives the bass a tightness that cuts through really well in the mix and live. Then once Will played with his EQ, then I had a box made with variable frequencies and variable Qs, and we pretty much settled on 500 hertz with a wide Q, and that became the special feature of one of the special features of the Will Lee model. It's my only bass that has any kind of boost in the mids, and it's frequency selectable at 500 or 800 hertz. Again, this is where I feel my acoustic guitar background has really contributed to what I do, in the sense that I still approach electric solid body instruments as acoustic instruments. In my early years of doing a lot of mods, I would take two J basses, and I would do the same work, let's say what I did for Marcus on both basses, and one bass would just be amazing, and the other honestly wasn't all that much better than before I started. And my experience was that the lighter weight basses that sounded better acoustically were always the ones that sounded better amplified. And so I started advocating that as early as 1981. It's still my philosophy today. We do lightweight chambered bodies to increase the resonance. My advice to anybody buying any bass is, if you're comparing 2 or 3 of the same model, I mean, it doesn't make sense to compare apples and oranges, but let's say you're in a music store and you're trying out 3 jazz basses, I say the one that sounds the best acoustically, that would be the one I would pick. For Jason, one of the biggest issues for him in terms of settling down with my basses is he sweats so profusely during a show that he would short out other basses. Sweat would creep in the pickup routes and get into the control cavity, and the techs would tell me stories that they could open up the jack plate on the side and liquid would just pour out. So the biggest challenge for Jason was essentially waterproofing his instruments. So we did that with a combination of gaskets at the control plate and the jack plate, and silicone caulking on the holes connecting the pickup routes to the control cavity. So the big challenge for Jason was making him instruments that could withstand that type of abuse and not fail on him. Tal came along when she was very young. She was 17, I guess, when I met her. And she had come over from Australia. She hadn't even completed high school and was attending the Los Angeles Music Academy as a guitar student. And one of my close friends, his name is Andrew Campbell, was also at the school at the same time. And he saw her slapping on a guitar. And he said, "Tal, you're playing the wrong instrument. You should play bass." And he got her connected with a bass, and she just took off as an incredible prodigy on bass. So he brought her to me, to my shop, and we basically made her pretty much a standard ash body maple neck J bass. I made the nut width and the neck a little smaller for her hands. The only other thing we had to do different for her was she wanted a narrower string spacing at the right hand. So I had to get, at that time, my bridge was 19 millimeter, and she needed something about 18 millimeters. So I picked up an ABM bridge with adjustable string spacing and got it at 18 millimeter, and that was it. That's the bass she still plays today. And I'll be honest, I've made her at least a dozen other basses, and which and she's got a handful that she loves and uses. Recently, a couple years ago, got her with a P bass that she adores, and it's several 5 strings. But that 4 string is the one for her, and it's the one she always loves to use. What happened for me is I was taking what Leo did and bringing it up to another level in terms of my workmanship and the electronics and shielding and all of that. Then what happened is, so let's back up to about 1980. All right, guy would come to me, needs a good bass. I wasn't building basses at that time. I'd say, go get a nice early 60s L series jazz bass. Those are my favorites personally. And you could buy one at that time for about $850. And then they'd bring it to me, and I would do about $500, $600, $700 worth of work, fret job, preamp, bridge, whatever. And so for $1,500, they had a really solid working man's instrument that they could take to any studio, any gig, blah, blah, blah. By the mid-'80s, the vintage market started to take off. And then I realized that everything I was doing to upgrade these instruments was devaluing them. So that's the time that I decided I should really focus on building my own instruments and bring everything Leo brought to the table and everything that I could bring to the table. The other issue, the reason my instruments are so Fender inspired is because back in the early 80s, if you got the New York Union Directory, Musicians Union Directory, there were 2 chapters for bass. One was acoustic bass and one was Fender bass. That was it. Fender bass was electric bass. And you really couldn't walk into a studio in New York at that time with anything but a P bass or a J bass. A lot of the studio work in those days were jingles, commercials. They were short 40, 45-minute sessions. An engineer was not going to spend 10 minutes with a bass he was unfamiliar with to dial in a sound. So there was great pressure for the players to bring in a Fender, and there was great pressure from the engineers to bring in a Fender. So I decided, as much as I wanted to make something more original, I decided to make as Fender-like an instrument as I could, but that brought everything I could bring to the table. It started when I started having players call me saying all of a sudden they were having a hum problem with their bass. And so I would troubleshoot it with them over the phone. And I said, when you plug into an amp, you're hearing the hum. They'd say yes. I say, if you touch the bridge, does the hum go away? They would say yes. I'd say, if you touch the output jack, does the hum go away? They'd say yes. And I'd say, if you touch the strings, does the hum go away? And they would say no. And then I'd say, are you using Cody strings? And they would say yes. And that's when I realized that the coatings were probably non-conductive. The science of a string ground is that there's a wire underneath the bridge that goes to ground, or earth, as you like to say, in the control cavity. The strings, when you touch the strings with your hand, you are completing that earth loop and eliminating the hum. There are people who feel, and again, I just went on a thread, an internet thread about this issue where people posted my article saying, oh, it's not the strings, you just have to shield the instrument. That's not true. Even a totally shielded instrument in a noisy environment with noisy wiring or fluorescent lighting, you'll have some hum. Other people have said that you have to use a pickup like EMG that doesn't use string grounds. Well, the truth is I've always had to use string grounds with EMGs because in stage situations with Vari-Lights and in Broadway pits and old wiring in old buildings, you still get hum even with EMGs. So the bottom line, it is the strings. So one of the bass magazines in the States had just done a review of a company's coated strings, and I wrote a letter to the editor discussing the issue. And he emailed me back and he said, do you really expect me to print this? Just like that. And then I realized that advertiser pressure was obviously at work. So I took it on myself. I bought every coated string on the market. I tested them all for conductivity. And I only found 2 strings that were conductive. And so I wrote an article on it, and I published it in a small niche bass magazine in the States called Best Bass Gear. Yeah, I stand by my experience. I really do. The 2 were D'Addario and Cleartone. And I think the difference is that they coat the wrap wire before they wrap the string, and it's a thin coating. The other strings are dipped after the entire string is done, and those coatings just are not conductive. And I'm really shocked that people, number one, want to argue that I'm not correct, and I'm shocked that the industry hasn't dealt with it. I mean, I would think you could add an additive to the coatings that would be conductive. And I'm really surprised that this issue hasn't been addressed more broadly. My setup is to go for as straight a neck as possible. And I start there because how you set up a bass is a function of typically how hard the player plays. The harder the player digs in, the more relief you probably need to have in the neck, and the higher the action. But starting for someone who plays lighter or with a lower action, I like to go for a straight neck. Action-wise, I hold the string down at the 1st fret, and I measure with a ruler at the 12th fret, and I measure from the underside of the string to the top of the fret. And I'm holding down the string to eliminate the nut height as affecting what I'm reading. So you could put a capo on the 1st fret and do the same thing. And so for a low action, I like, and I'll be talking in inches, but I like 2 32nds of an inch on the G string, and a little under 3 32nds of an inch on the E string. And then the D and the A are graduated. You know, the D is a little higher than the G, and the A is a little higher than the D. And on a 5 string, I will go just a touch over a full 3 32nds on the B string. So that's a reasonably low action. And for me, a high action for someone who plays really hard, really likes to dig in with their right hand, I'll do a little more relief in the neck. Not a lot, but a little more. And I'll do from 2.5 32nds, so 5/64 on the G, up to as high as 4 32nds on the B string. I think players should learn to set up their own instruments. It's not rocket science, and it's so sensitive to one's touch that I absolutely encourage every guitar and bass player to learn to do these basic adjustments for themselves. It's really not that difficult. You know, in the old days, people used to be afraid you could break a truss rod if you tighten it too much. I haven't seen a broken truss rod in a very long time. So there's no fear there. You can always undo what you do. If you think about adjusting a truss rod 1/8 of a turn, if that's too much, you back it off half that much. If you adjusting your bridge saddles, and if you, let's say, go up a half a turn on each screw on the saddle, and that's too high, then you back it off and you do 1/4 of a turn on each. But people should not be intimidated to try it out. And if they totally mess it up, the worst case scenario is they bring it to someone for a setup. But I really encourage players to learn to do this basic type of maintenance themselves.